Hello, everyone, and welcome to ESM's presentation on the upcoming digital SAT. So I'm Brian Smith. I'm the Director of Curriculum for Test Prep for ESM. I'm based on the West Coast here in the United States. And here I have with me Niall to help present.
I'm Niall. I help run Test Prep internationally, and I also help lead our London office. And front and center of our mind at the moment is the switch to the digital SAT for international students, which we will certainly get into today.
Yep. And so here's kind of the plan for kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So broadly speaking, we're just going to be talking about what are the changes to the SAT? What does this new digital SAT look like? How is it going to be offered like internationally? And how is it going to change like the test prep plan for international students in general? And then we'll be going in some depth on the test itself as well, but just mostly focusing on the big picture changes, really. Okay, so here's kind of what we consider like the big overview of all the overall changes. First, most importantly, the new test will be beginning in March 2023. There is one more of the regular SATs in December next month, coming up in a couple weeks. After that, though, internationally, it will be only the digital test offered. So what do we mean when we say digital, right? We say the digital means that the SAT will now be offered on a computer or tablet, right? It will still be administered in schools or like in test centers, not at homes, but students will now be able to take it on a computer, and that they can either have the school provided or college board provided to them, or they can even bring in their own computers, which I think will be kind of the norm going forward, most likely, right? So that's the first big change. Obviously, it's all going to be on a computer now, very similar to the ACT computer-based testing exam, right? The next big difference is that the test will be much shorter, right? The current SAT right now takes about 3 hours, right? And the new one will be only 2 hours. So that we're literally slicing off a whole hour of testing here, right? And that's a big plus for a lot of students kind of looking for it. They can only have to spend 2 hours of their day taking a test. It's a pretty quick test. It goes by pretty quickly, right? And so then the question begs, like, then is like, how are they able to do that? Like, how are they able to, take a whole hour off of it and still make this a full standardized test? And that leads into the next big change. The test is now going to be what we call adaptive, right? What that means is that each of the two big sections, reading and writing, math, will now have 2 modules per each one. So when students take the first reading and writing module, basically the second module they get will depend on their performance in the first one. If they do very well on the first section on the reading writing one, then they'll get a harder section from the section 2. If they don't do as well on the first one, they'll get an easier one, right? And so the difference is that if you get the harder one, that will open up your potential to get a higher score overall, right? If you get the easier one, then it'll feel easier, but you won't be able to get as high of a score. So actually, we want students to kind of feel like the second part was harder because that means they got the second one, right?
Yeah, and I think I would just add in that, interestingly, one analogy that is incorrect here is that, I know if you're looking at ever any financial advice, it says future performance is not indicative of past performance. And it's kind of the opposite here, right? Your future performance can be indicative of your past performance because you will see a different cohort of questions depending on how you performed in the earlier modules.
Yep. And then so the other kind of like small change with this is that does also kind of mean that like basically every student will be taking a different test. They'll have similar questions, but they might be in different orders. The models will be different, right? So that's different, right? That's not the case now for even the ACT CBT computer-based test. That every student takes the test on the same date. Well, not every, but most students take the same test, right? And that is not the case with this new SAT. They will be different, right? So then the last thing is the point scale. This is actually not changing. This is exactly the same as the current SAT. So it'll still be scored out of 1600. The reading writing will still be out of 800, and the math will still be out of 800. And combined, they add up to 1600. That is exactly the same. They are not changing that at all, right? And from the perspective of colleges, the College Board has said that colleges will not differentiate between a score on a digital SAT versus a score on the current SAT, right? If you get a 1340 on the current SAT, that's supposed to mean the same thing as getting a 1340 on the digital test, right? So they're really trying to keep that part consistent.
No guarantees from our end, but supposed to.
Right. Yes, this is what the College Board says. Right. It is ultimately up to the colleges themselves to make that decision. Right. And we think they will, but we don't know yet for sure. Okay. So next up, we have all the kind of the upcoming dates for both of the tests, just so we can get a broad view of what the testing kind of profile looks like in this upcoming spring. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the last paper-based SAT on December 3rd, right? And then the first digital SAT is March 11th. And then after that is all digital for national students, right? And so we want to show here is that basically moving forward during the school year, there will basically be pretty much always one test per month, right? At least, right? Some tests have multiple dates, as you can see, but always they will tend to alternate. So there'll be plenty of options available for students to take the test. And then also for the digital SAT specifically, this is another kind of new change. They'll now be offering SATs in June and November, which is not the case internationally. It was for the US, but it was not, those dates were not available. So the College Board is changing that. So now that the international offerings will match the US offerings, right? So there's wide flexibility in terms of kind of test offer and that kind of stuff. Now, any additional thoughts here?
No, I mean, a couple of years ago, we used to have a lot of students that would take their SAT subject tests in the sort of summer months around May, June, and the College Board removed the SAT subject tests a couple of years ago. So they're no longer in play. And yeah, it's good. I think that it gives students more options. It doesn't mean that you have to test every date, and it doesn't necessarily mean that more is better. But it means it can fit around your other schedules, and you can have more consideration for focusing on your grades or your APs and a bit more maneuverability around that. And also think that summer prep, we've noticed that that's continued to become increasingly important. And yeah, I think it really just goes back to more options. So coming up with a solid plan and being prudent is probably just generally good advice. So not that much changes. ACT and SAT, similar cadence per year.
Yep. Okay, so then now I'm going to go dive a little bit more in depth on what exactly is changing with the SAT itself, because within the test, there are some changes too as well. Probably the biggest one, and possibly most surprising, given that the overall test length is now only 2 hours, and there actually is more time per question. In fact, a lot more. The College Board kind of purposely designed the test to kind of get rid as much as possible of that stressful feeling of not being able to finish the test in time. Right. So on both sections, but especially math, there is a lot more time per question. Right. They give you a lot of time to really make sure that you put the best answer you can in. It's not, it's not infinite. It still is a time test. Some students will struggle with timing for sure, but they did make an effort to make that much more better. Right. Second big change is that they have combined the reading and writing sections. On the current SAT, these two are different. The section 1 is strictly reading and section 2 is strictly writing. Now they've combined them into one kind of big thing. And other big difference now is that on the reading passages on the current SAT, they're very long and very dense. You have to read a full text with 4 or 5 paragraphs and answer 10 to 11 questions on that. It's completely different on this test. Now they'll just give you 1 paragraph and 1 question. 1 paragraph, 1 question, 1 paragraph, 1 question, and again, and that's the whole test. So it's much shorter, right? And there's a lot less kind of, I would say, deep comprehension. Still some, right? The paragraphs aren't necessarily easy, but I would say they are definitely easier than the current SAT in that sense, right? So that's a pretty big change, right? Content-wise, other than that, though, it hasn't changed too much. The writing is still mostly grammar, punctuation, that kind of thing. Nothing, no big structural changes other than that, right? But it will be a different test experience for sure. I think a lot of students will just feel that taking this test will just feel easier than the current SAT, especially on reading, that's for sure. Now with math, the content is pretty much the same. The big change here is that now graphing calculators will be allowed on the entire test. On the current SAT, there's a math no calculator section and then a math calculator section. Now it's just everything is a calculator. And not only that, there's also a built-in calculator, which is what we have kind of showing here on the screen. It's a built-in Desmos calculator that students can actually use within what is called the Blue Book app, right? So being proficient with these kind of calculators is going to be a big part of doing well on this test. They definitely are very helpful for a lot of the problems. And that's another way that could make this test feel easier to a lot of students if they're comfortable with that, right? And last kind of thing here, like there is still technically a paper format will still technically be available, but only if you have specific accommodations for it, right? Which, so that's only something that if a student like has accommodations from school that shows they need to do things on paper. Otherwise, it's a computer test, pretty much. Niall, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest change really will be in the reading section in
Yeah.
terms of how we're going to teach it. And an analogy one of our partners used was that, I mean, not to overstretch the word, but nearly adaptability or agility in terms of it's a little bit like TikTok. You've got to be able to switch from one passage to the other very quickly. I think we'll be a little sad in that we probably spent too much time on some of the passages on the old SAT, some 18th century passages that we spent dozens of hours on, but it's a welcome change. I think that, yeah, the average time per question on the maths, I think, will now be around 90 seconds, which is a considerable amount of time. And we're very familiar with Desmos. That will change a little bit how we teach it. But again, nothing too surprising. I think that maybe one thing we can do is, can you define what Blue Book is for the uninitiated?
So that's this picture here is actually a screenshot of what is College Board's Blue Book app. And so that's an app that they created for the digital SAT that students will need to install on their computer to take the test, right? That actually is what we'll be talking about here is the logistical changes, right? So that's kind of the first thing is that now students, before they take the test, will need to download this Blue Book app to their computers and have it ready to go before test date, right? If they're using their own computers, of course, right? If you aren't using your computer, then you'll just go to school and they'll have it ready to go for you, right? Otherwise, the kind of big changes is that a lot of reasons why they made the computer test is that it's a lot easier to administer, right? It's much easier for proctors to just get everyone set up the computers. Proctors have to worry about the timing. The test app itself will take care of the timing, right? So there's no more, the proctor saying 5 minutes left or 3 minutes left, or anything like that, which, so that's just totally different. There's a timer built into the app that tracks it itself. And then of course, the next probably most important change is that now, just like the ACT computer test, scores will be coming out much quicker. The current score release window for the SAT is weeks. So it usually takes 2 to 3 weeks for the score release to come out, right? And now with this computer test, it's much faster. It will be more like, I think like 3 to 4 days, business days, like a week at most, which is pretty much what the computer-based ACT is like right now, right? So that's a big change, right? And it makes it much easier to kind of keep the momentum going, right? You get your test, you don't have to wait at all, wait too long for your scores back. You get your scores, you see how you did, you start getting ready for the next test, like pretty much immediately, right? Yeah, so all the big changes. Anything here now?
No, I mean, I think that it's certainly not a reason to pick the SAT over the ACT, but
Sure.
the app experience itself is very smooth. They clearly spent a lot of time on this, and I think part of that is also the experience they had with administering digital tests for the APs.
Yeah.
Which were administered by the College Board. And yeah, they've really thought through problems like connectivity issues, charging issues, etc. But we would cover all of that if the digital SAT is the right fit test for you. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, the app is really smooth. I was pretty impressed when I was taking like, their practice test. Like it's really clear. Everything is pretty straightforward. They have pretty clear like tools that you can use to annotate on the app, right? And lots of things that you can do with it. And it was pretty nice, actually.
Yeah, I think some of our students would probably respectfully disagree.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not
The
perfect.
disclaimer that Brian and I, for some reason or another, really enjoy these tests, so we probably have propensity to want to like them.
Yep. Okay, so now diving a little bit more into what the adaptive means, right? So the first thing is that the SC will be what we call section adaptive as opposed to question adaptive, right? All that means is that students will do a full section and then it will adapt, right? As I said earlier, um, the second module they get will be based on how well they do on the module as a whole, as opposed to the individual questions, right? So there's two overall sections, reading, writing, math, and then two modules each for 4 modules overall, right? And so then, as I mentioned earlier, that allows the College Board to make sure that each student doesn't have the same test, right? And so this helps them kind of preserve the test, it prevents cheating and that kind of thing. So that's why they're doing it, right? And then finally, the last kind of important point here for students taking this test that they'll need to keep in mind is that question that we have seen so far, that questions in Module 1 generally count more for the overall score than for the larger test. So that general accuracy and avoiding small mistakes matters for the test as a whole, but it will really matter in those first couple modules, right? Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about the big picture, right? So first, as we mentioned earlier, there are 2 new test dates, June, November, that have been added to match the US testing schedule. So now the international calendar looks pretty much the exact testing calendar looks pretty much the exact same as the US one as we saw earlier. Okay, so now what do we think? Digital SAT or ACT? What should students take?
So, I mean, there's no real cookie cutter approach here, and it has to be nuanced. But I would say the way to think about this, if you haven't started your testing journey for an international student, is to take a diagnostic ACT first, and really think about eliminating the ACT. And I think the big reason that we'll see for students eliminating the ACT as a potential right fit test is really timing. So I was speaking to Brian about one of our first cohort of students who the digital SAT is the right fit. He was only able to complete 37 questions out of 60 on the diagnostic ACT. And even with a lot of prep, we don't think we would be able to get him near completion. He's a very competent math student. So going from 60 seconds on average per question on the ACT math section to 90 seconds approximately on average per question on the digital SAT is a big difference. So yeah, I think that for students who haven't started their test prep journey, getting in contact with us, and we'll really walk you through each step, and that begins with an ACT. And I think that generally speaking, we don't want students to be sort of guinea pigs, and this was our advice in fall 2018, when the ACT computer-based test was being rolled out. That being said, we had students that took the first computer-based ACT, scored very well after a couple of test sittings, submitted those scores and got into a college of their choice. So our real guidance here is that it's not a you can take away, okay, this test or this test is the right fit from this webinar. This is really to equip you with what are the big changes. And I think one of the things we're thinking about is that a lot of families we're speaking to hear digital on the SAT, hear computer based on the ACT, and think they're somewhat similar. And it's really that adaptive nature that's changing things considerably. And we've already had students try and think about game theory, how do we work through this? And our advice will be quite straightforward: get better at the test. And we have dozens of team members across the companies worldwide who are working on making sure that we're fully equipped for this. So think about the ACT first and think about eliminating that. If the digital SAT is the right fit for you, we can fully support that.
Yeah, that sounds good. So yeah, to summarize, basically, I would say there's a lot of small differences between the tests, but the biggest one is that AEC is definitely more time intensive, especially with these changes to digital SAT that give more time per question, all that stuff. Students will notice the difference when they're taking both tests. And I will say for most students, they will probably indicate a pretty strong preference for whichever test they feel like is the best, right? But that said, this digital SAT is still a new test for now, right? And that means, College Board is maybe trying out new stuff, right? So you don't necessarily want to be the guinea pig, and the ACT is the known quantity. So, that's, as Niall said, is one we would want to start off with for now, right? And the last thing to kind of keep in mind now is that now that the scores come out pretty quickly, like you can make this decision just by taking 2 official tests now as too. You don't have to, but since those scores come back pretty quickly, you can students can take these tests for real, see how it goes, right? And then just make the final decision for which test to pick for after that, right? And so remember now for both tests, like students always will choose what scores colleges they will want to send to colleges. So colleges will never see these first tests unless the student scores well enough and wants them to see it, right? So there's no reason to not take a test. You don't have to be afraid of a bad score, right? If you get a bad score, you just don't send it, right? Okay. Okay, so SAT prep, right? So how will this change now? How will preparing for the digital SAT be different from this current paper-based SAT? So first, one big difference here is that there will be much fewer released practice tests, and that's because there will not be what we call the question answer service. What that means is that for some current SATs, students can purchase the question answer service, which allows them to see the full test along with their missed answer choices, meaning they can review the test in full, which is very valuable for future preparation. Unfortunately, College Board is completely getting rid of that with the digital SAT. It will no longer exist at all, right? So this means that in the future, when students take a test and they get their score back, that's pretty much all they'll see is their score. They will not be able to see the questions they missed. They won't be able to review it in depth at all or anything, right? So that's a big change, right? That's definitely something to keep in mind. ACT still does have that to an extent, although that's a little complicated, but the SAT won't even have it at all, right? Not only that, is there also isn't too many like kind of practice tests for it yet. So right now, College Board has released 4 digital practice tests, right, that are available online to take, right? But that's it, right? It's not too many, right? I think they said that they will be adding more in the future, but it's not going to be too much more. I think they said they're going to get up to 8 in the long term, and that's pretty much it. Whereas for the ACT, we have 60, like upwards of 60 released prior exams. So there's just a lot more practice available for the ACT, right? One of the reasons why it might be better to prepare for it, right? So that doesn't mean that there aren't resources for it, of course, right? The test is pretty new, but the content is largely the same as the current SAT. So lots of current SAT resources can still work, although there will be some parts that are outdated, especially on the reading section, right? And so the trade-off between not having the question and answer surveys is that since there are more tests, like you can just keep taking the test multiple times. It'll be much easier and more available to take the test more frequently, so they'll have more chances to make sure that they get the score they want, right? Now, any additional thoughts here?
No, I think you're quite comprehensive there. I think that really the takeaway is probably we're spending a lot of time thinking about this. I know
Yeah,
Brian calls every week. We have 490 calls across different companies. We're really thinking about how we can best support students here. And so yeah, it's going to be nuanced and it's going to be different. I think it's exciting. But yeah, it's really this slide's dependent on whether the SAT is the right fit for you.
yeah.
If you're a student that's just considering test prep, this is a later conversation, and we'll start off with an ACT diagnostic.
Yep. Cool. Okay, so then last kind of thing is like this is just the kind of stuff that we're going to be looking forward as this test, comes into play, and we'll just be comparing it. So first, we want to see like how the ACT will respond to this test. So far, the answer is not at all. They haven't really changed at all, but we'll be curious to see if they, redesign their test. Are they going to make their ACT adaptive, right? I don't think so. The ACT is generally change resistant. They tend to do things the same way. The only big change they've made recently was making the computer test. That's it, right? But we'll see. You never know. And so the second thing is we talked a little bit about this earlier is, how will college admissions like think about these changes? Will they still evaluate the digital SAT as the same as the current SAT? As we said, we think they will, but we'll be keeping an eye on it and to figure out if that changes at all. And if they do, we'll let you know, of course, right? So the next big thing is logistics, right? How successful is this March International SAT going to be, right? Because they're rolling this out for all international sites across the world, right? That's a big endeavor to do for something like this. And for this drastic a change, it will be very interesting to say the least, right? To see how well it kind of goes off. So just something that we'll be keeping an eye out, right? And then the last point is that this is a bit more of a long-term one, but College Board has said that for the US, in the US, they will be offering more of the school day SATs in the future. So they'll be trying to make it much more available at the students' actual school themselves, right? And so they said that they're going to do that, although they haven't announced any specifics yet. So we'll be keeping an eye on whether they're going to do that internationally as well, right? And if they do, that will increase the frequency of available tests to take even higher, right? It will be even more opportunities to take the test and get the score that you're looking for, right? So these are just all kind of the things that we'll be keeping an eye on and just updating you all as we get any answers, right? Okay. Okay, that's pretty much it. Now, any last thoughts or anything?
No, I mean, I think that we could probably keep going for another hour and really get into the weeds about even things like the ACT being computer-based test internationally, but that hasn't changed in the US domestically, and it's been 4 years. That timeline was changed, albeit due to COVID, etc. So I think the path forward is somewhat known, but also there are things we don't know, and we'll be learning and we'll be adapting accordingly. So I think the takeaway, if you're a family that's considering test prep, is reach out to us. And you can reach out to me directly because I'm speaking with a lot of our families, particularly internationally, about what the right fit tests are. Happy to walk you through it a little bit in depth, depending on your current situation, which year group you're in, how you're thinking about test prep, because it might be different if you're testing in 2 years as opposed to testing in 6 or 9 months.
Yep.
So we'll be adapting accordingly. If you want to reach out to me directly, it's Niall at esmprep.com. So NIALL at esmprep.com, and I'm generally responsive. So feel free to connect directly. And thanks for joining.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.